Sri Lanka prepares for a new president as a political dynasty falls. Anti-government protests force the president to flee. Parliament plans to appoint his successor, but can anyone turn the country's fortunes around? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Sri Lanka. After months of protests defined by chants of Gota go home, Sri Lanka's demonstrators can claim a major breakthrough. Gotabaya Rajapaksa, whose family has held political domination over the island nation for close to 2 decades, has fled the country. Last week, the now former president was forced out of office after thousands of protesters, angered by an economic collapse they say he engineered, stormed his residence in the capital. And once his resignation was confirmed, many came out to celebrate.
We are happy as a collective effort because the citizen struggle of Sri Lanka was participated by all the citizens of Sri Lanka.
So this is really something amazing. The fact that it happened on the back of largely peaceful protests that just happened not in Colombo but across the country. And so in that sense, this is really an amazing moment. And it's not something that we could think, but obviously this is just the beginning, that there is a longer journey in terms of the kind of work that has to be done, not just to rebuild the economy, but to create public confidence in this political system.
So even with the president gone, there's still plenty of work ahead, and many protesters are still equally unhappy with the man who's temporarily taken the reins, Ranil Wickremesinghe. The leader of the United National Party is a familiar face to all Sri Lankans. He's already served as prime minister multiple times and now looks likely to become president. Parliament has begun the process of choosing Rajapaksa's successor, and Wickremesinghe is the favorite.
We took the streets today because President Ranil Wickremesinghe must vacate his seat. Ranil Wickremesinghe has no support from the people and no mandate to rule.
Well, whoever does take office will have a monumental task on their hands. Millions across the country are struggling to make ends meet. Living costs are rising daily, power cuts are common, and food and fuel are in short supply. Drivers have to wait days for gas to arrive, and when it does, lines to fill their cars can go on for miles.
Everything is gone out. That's all. No business, no money, everything finished.
I wait in the petrol fuel maybe 3-4 days. Sometimes I will not give them my money, my wife and children. You know, they want for every day maximum 2,000 rupees to my house. I want to give to my wife. Then 3-4 days wait in the petrol fuel. Then big problem for me.
So progress on protesters' demands, but the daily challenges in Sri Lankan life remain and could still get worse. Joining me now to debate where Sri Lanka goes from here are from Liverpool, political analyst Sesiri Pathirane. From Lisbon is Satyam Sukumaran. He is a human rights advocacy officer at People for Equality and Relief in Sri Lanka. And from London is Keenan, the International Crisis Group's senior Sri Lanka analyst. Thanks all so much for being with us. Alan, it took months, but Gotabaya Rajapaksa has finally left and resigned. Given, though, what the country is up against and the state of the economy, do you think better days are actually ahead?
Well, not in the short term, but hopefully in the longer term they will be. The eviction of Gotabaya was, I think, a great success of people power. It was a real widespread, island-wide effort to push him out, and clearly he and his family were a large part of the problem. But they're not the only part of the problem. The whole political setup, the whole political class is clearly resistant to the kinds of change that need to happen. And then even if they were on board with making the kinds of structural reforms that are needed, the economic crisis is acute and growing more acute. And the answers to that are very complicated and may not be entirely popular with people. So there's a long road ahead.
Right. Sesiri, many have said that the political elite are just too embedded in the government, so that even if you got Gotabaya Rajapaksa out, The rest of them are still there. Right now we have Ranil Wickremesinghe, of course. So you've succeeded in overthrowing the government, but now who steps in to fill this void?
Well, I did not.
I mean Sri Lankans in general, yes, the protesters in Sri Lanka.
I mean, as much as I kind of like, how Alan kind of phrases things, but it's also extremely important to understand that this was a president and a government that came into power with overwhelming majority. And the parliament basically had a 2/3 of majority when they were elected. And what I kind of see is this is sort of a classic case of lack of diplomacy on President Gotabaya's end. And of course, President Mahinda, as far as we know, he tried to talk to him. He tried to ask him to be diplomatic with some of the minority parties, but that didn't happen, according to my understanding. So I kind of see this as a classic case of lack of diplomacy on his side.
Okay. That, some say, would be putting it very mildly about the mistakes he made. It's far more than a lack of diplomacy, according to many Sri Lankans. I mean, you actually have celebrated before the Rajapaksa's economic achievements and how you think they oversaw the boom times and the successes they had. But many argue that that boom was, of course, on borrowed money, and that it is the Rajapaksa's fault for sowing the demise of the country in the end. Why do you give the Rajapaksas more credit than the thousands of protesters we've seen coming out onto the streets?
Well, I mean, what you need to understand here is that, obviously, I mean, even towards the very end, I personally wanted President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to resign because I honestly thought that, he was not capable of handling the situation. And but at the same time, if you look at President Mahinda Rajapaksa's time, there was significant economic growth, and the GDP tripled. GDP basically tripled, right? And that has never happened. And this was during a wartime as well, and that has never really happened under any presidency that I have seen in any other country. And at the same time, what happened was very unfortunate. I also personally wanted him to resign, but this notion of people throwing him out. I mean, what you saw there was basically about 5,000 people, and even out of them, we now know that a lot of these guys were basically funded by several groups. And there's just this morning, we heard that there's an investigation going on for 3 people getting, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, it's 450 million rupees coming into 3 of their accounts. So I don't really think that this is this is where the entire country stands.
Sesiri, let me just ask you then quickly: do you think Sri Lankans will come to miss the Rajapaksas?
It happened in 2015. I'm pretty sure it's going to happen again. I mean, everybody said, when they were sent home in 2015, everybody said they're never going to come back to power. And look what happened in 2019. I mean, they came back with a majority support, with an overwhelmingly 2/3 majority in the parliament.
Fair enough. Satyam, are you on the same page there? I mean, some say the protest movement, especially according to Sesiri, is certainly the loudest, but not necessarily the majority.
Ironically, there's probably not many times where I will agree with Sesiri, but something he said was quite poignant there. So in 2015, the Rajapaksas lost power and they came back into 2019. And Sesiri alludes to potentially the Rajapaksas coming back to power again. I'm not sure if it will be the Rajapaksas, but there's something underlying that's quite important to understand about Sri Lanka. And it's actually, so what caused the Rajapaksas to lose power and then come back into power with the kind of the mass support of the average voter in the South? And that's where we feel it's one of the root causes of instability in Sri Lanka. So what happened was when he came back to power in 2019, Rajapaksa stood on a very ultra-nationalist Sinhala platform where it was about protecting the Sinhala Buddhist state and kind of furthering that in terms of like a new constitution, which said one law, one country, which again kind of further embedded Sinhala Buddhist nationalism into the way the state operates. So I feel that the fact that they were able to mobilize that sentiment and come back to power means that the mass electorate in the South is still vulnerable to some kind of populist, ultra-nationalist, stoking those kind of tendencies deep within them to come back to power. Now, why is this bad for the Sri Lanka's crisis? Well, because for them to come to power, they need a long-term, stable, reformist government. However, if the majority population is still vulnerable to kind of almost racist sectarianism, that means any person that kind of runs that platform could suddenly come back to power and collapse a reform government. And this is where we can also look at the current reform movement. So the protests have been really promising. They managed to peacefully kind of get a change of president. But when you look at the work they're doing in terms of, it's a kind of historic shortcoming of civil society in general. But when you look at the work that's been done, if you look at the official protest demands, they haven't confronted this kind of the singularist nationalist aspect of the majority electorate. So they haven't done things like legitimizing issues of the North and East, for example, the issue of militarization, the issue of accountability for mass atrocities, or the issue of devolution of powers. So these things haven't been done. They haven't been legitimized to the majority population in the South, the average Sinhalese voter. So that means in the future, in another election cycle, you can have another Rajapaksa-like figure gaining this mass support that Syriza talks about coming back to power. And we all know these kind of governments don't run stable economies, and they don't act in a rational way. So there's a lot of work to be done going forward.
Right. Alan, let me ask you about that. I mean, maybe not Rajapaksa himself, though Sesiri thinks that could even be possible, but a Rajapaksa-like figure instead, perhaps coming to power in Sri Lanka. I mean, what would that mean for the country? What would this all have been for?
Well, I don't see that happening quickly, but I do agree that that the reservoirs of Sinhala Buddhist nationalism run very deep and are very powerful, and they haven't gone away. I would disagree a little bit with the analysis that there wasn't any attempts by the current sort of protest movement to integrate or to address or to raise the concerns of Tamils and the history of violence by the state against the Tamil community and the various other issues around land and militarization that Tamils have been protesting about literally for years. There wasn't enough, but that's a real challenge. And I think there were efforts that shouldn't be dismissed to begin that very long road of trying to integrate the different communities, different grievances. I mean, those sorts of conversations and efforts will take years, if not decades, even with the best sort of will on everyone's side, which of course doesn't always exist. So I think there could be a Rajapaksa-like figure. I just think just one other point in terms of Sesiri's suggestion that that we saw them come back in 2019 and we could see them come back again. I think the Rajapaksa brand is so much more badly damaged now than it was in 2015. In 2015, people were a bit pissed off with them. They saw corruption, abuse of power. They were just a bit fed up, but they weren't masses of people on the streets demanding that they go.
Okay, and let me ask you just quickly, Alan. I mean, we're talking now about like longer-term possible return of either Rajapaksa-like figures or the family itself. But in the meantime, in the immediate term, you're saying in order to even start to reform in Sri Lanka, that the presidential system needs to be changed entirely, if I haven't misunderstood you. So Sri Lanka is actually facing structural reforms as well politically. How difficult is that going to be for whichever new leadership takes place or takes power?
Well, it'll be very difficult because, I mean, the history in Sri Lanka the last, I don't know, at least 30 years has been that virtually every party, when they're out of power, wants to eliminate the executive presidency system, which gives enormous centralizing power to the president. But when whoever actually occupies that post is a little less enthusiastic about getting rid of it. So Ranil Wickremesinghe, who may well be elected by parliament as the next president, has said he will go back to what this in-between situation they had in 2015, according to the 19th Amendment, where the president's powers are trimmed and he works more closely with the prime minister, sort of a cohabitation system. That would be better, but it's not good enough. And it's hard to see any of the likely victors really pushing hard on eliminating the executive presidency, which is certainly, I think, and many people think, would be a very a very good thing. It would open up the political system considerably and throw the ball into the court of parliament, which is more fully representative.
Fair enough. Sesiri, do you think it's unlikely to happen, but should happen? This changing the presidential system?
I believe so. I mean, I'm a supporter in the abolition of the executive presidency for good. I mean, while it may have sort of helped in certain times during the war times, but I think we don't need it anymore, and it needs to be abolished.
Okay, Satyam, are you on the same page there?
I think, yeah, so the executive presidency is a symptom of a larger problem. Yes, it needs to be abolished. It's not healthy to have that many powers centralized under one office. But just alluding to what Alan said, he goes, they've tried to get rid of it for 30 years. And this, again, this is where you can look at the root. So the executive presidency came into power. It was established in 1978 by a then liberal government, or technically liberal, but Western-facing government, run by the UNP, with a president called J.R.J. Wardener. So that was brought in 1978. But now, if you look at the reason why it was brought in, you will understand the deeper issues. So in 1972, Sri Lanka's constitution changed from a normal one to a kind of a unitary state, which also gave first and foremost place for singular Buddhism. That happened in 1972. And in the next elections in 76, you suddenly had the North and East because of those changes that happened where the state was moving away from a secular state to a more ethno-nationalist state. The North and East voted in a party that called for full self-determination for the North and East, and they became the official opposition in parliament. So that was the environment when the executive presidency came to power. And then at the same time, you also had militant movements starting up to kind of resist this kind of ethno-nationalism of the state. So that was when the executive presidency came into power. It was also seen as a way to preserve the singular Buddhist national state. So now over 30 years, whenever someone comes to try and get rid of it, people can stoke that kind of nationalist sentiment again. And that's why they always touch you about trying to get rid of it. Like already with these protests, you've had extremist monks come out in media and talk about, look, we need to protect the singular Buddhist state. So because over many years, it's not actually the fault of the average voter. It's not the fault of the average singular voter, because they're just fed the narratives that get to them. But there has been a shortcoming in civil society, in analysts, in international donors, in the way they give money to the state and to civil society, in not addressing this root cause in the majority population. Because until you change the hearts and minds of the people, you can never put forward reforms, because anyone can then use any reform to stoke this nationalist mindset and just bring it to a halt. And that has been a long history of Sri Lanka.
Understood. I'd actually like to go back to the immediate questions, if we can. Sesiri, I'll come back to you, because something very important that's happening now is Ranil Wickremesinghe saying that he is now close, so Sri Lanka is now close to reaching a deal with the IMF. That will be fundamental in trying to get Sri Lanka back on track. First of all, do you believe they're close to a deal, and do you believe it will be beneficial for Sri Lanka, or could it potentially dig the hole even deeper as far as Sri Lanka's debt is concerned, especially given what it hasn't been able to pay back in the past? What do you see on the economic front going forward?
Well, I mean, what we have is a dollar crisis, nothing else but a dollar crisis. And we immediately need some sort of what we call bridge financing to stay afloat. I mean, it's simple as that. And personally, I don't think there's anybody better than the current Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe to sort of secure this deal. And it's simple as that, really. And this dollar shortages mainly, in my opinion, was an outcome of two main mistakes that the President Gotabaya Rajapaksa government caused. One would be fixing the dollar at 202 rupees for nearly, I believe, 8 months or so, and then this impractical organic push. And sure, that was there in the manifesto as well, but this was a plan that needed to be done over a 10-year period. And all of a sudden, he just woke up one night and then decided he's going to ban, all sorts of fertilizer overnight. and that didn't quite work out for anybody. And there were a lot of internal discussions, and a lot of people were against it. But apparently he had some advisors who were advising him to go ahead with it. Then finally he himself came out and admitted that it was a mistake.
Okay. Well, Alan, let me ask you where you think relief could possibly lie now for Sri Lanka. I mean, there are also reports that deals with other countries have been made, though they have not specified who those loaning countries might be. And some say, as they have before, that Sri Lankan politicians are selling Sri Lanka's future to foreign creditors and even to the IMF. Where do you think relief could be found, if at all?
Well, I think the IMF, whatever relief comes from the IMF, won't come for 6 months or so. That's the general opinion, even once a deal is, what's called a staff level agreement, is reached. So we're talking sort of towards the end of the year, early next year. So in the meantime, as Sesiri says, you need some money. And I'm sure there are some countries, once there is a new government in place, who will be willing to support, to offer some of what the money is needed. But to be honest, it seems the hole is pretty big, and it's hard to see it being fully covered. India has been quite generous in the last 4 or 5 months, but of course not entirely generous in the sense that they've wanted things in exchange for their generosity. So they've gotten agreements for various projects, of development projects and security-related projects that the government had been resisting previously. I think China is in a similar situation. There's a few things they would like to get from Sri Lanka that maybe if they did, they'd be more, they'd open their checkbooks a bit more. But it's really hard to see where adequate money is going to come from. So I think what is absolutely essential is humanitarian relief, is food relief, is money to buy medicines and medical equipment, just to keep people from dying, keep people from starving.
Satyam, I mean, I've heard that before, because some have said that famine conditions could absolutely be on the horizon. There are massive food shortages already. But famine, do you see that in the future?
Yeah, well, even when we were speaking to civil society in the North and East, at least, they're predicting potential food shortages in August. And when I was in Sri Lanka a couple of months ago, when I spoke to protesters in the South, they were saying, or even Ranil Wickremesinghe was saying, potentially October in the South. So the whole island is feeling the brunt of the economic crisis. So that's a given. But as Alan says, like, I think a lot of international kind of the bilateral lenders that Sri Lanka was hoping for have been reserved. They haven't just been opening the gates, because everyone now understands that Sri Lanka isn't a stable state. They've waited 13 years, and it doesn't show any form of rational ability to form a rational kind of stable government. So when we look at the way India provided its money, some of the requirements it gave to Sri Lanka was to open up an airport in the North and East called Palali Airport, which used to connect India to the Tamil regions in Sri Lanka. Now, that deal has been going on for about 30 years, I think. They've also tried to open up a ferry service and a bridge. But for 30 years, they've struggled to get it implemented. And it's not such a complex thing, because the airport already exists in the North and East, but it's just been predominantly occupied by the military. So why does Sri Lanka fail to, for example, deliver on that international airport in the North? Again, it roots back to this concept of nationalism that's still been ingrained in the voter. So because it's ingrained in the voter and no work has been done to sell a pluralist idea of Sri Lanka, they're unable to make these reforms that would open up the economy and make Sri Lanka more democratic, evolved, and economically prosperous.
Okay, Sesiri, we have 1 minute left. I think you had a response, and I'll let you finish.
Absolutely. I mean, I kind of disagree in a way, how some of the media outlets are putting out this whole one Rajapaksa family, this corrupt Rajapaksa family bankrupted an entire nation. I mean, these are different entities, just like, although they may be brothers, they are different entities of their own, and they work with each other just like they would work with any other politician. And it's not like, they sit down at night and kind of chat what they're going to do and they do it the next morning. It's not the case. And that is very important to understand. And in terms of, racial integration, I don't think there's any other person in the history of Sri Lanka than President Mahinda Rajapaksa who did quite a lot for the ethnic minorities. I mean, this is a president who spoke in Tamil. No other president in the history of Sri Lanka has done it. And
yeah, but he's also accused of the massacre of over 100,000 Tamil civilians, and also accused of torture, overseeing the abduction of journalists, and he's got live lawsuits against him waiting for him in the US. So I think it's a far shot to try and paint that picture when a UN investigation has even said so.
Satyam, I'm going to have to let that, in fact, be the last word. We are very unfortunately out of time. I'm sure we'll be speaking exactly about that topic sometime in the near future. So I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.